Hello, and welcome back to YouTube in the second of my mini lectures. I hope you all enjoyed, or at least tolerated, your first reading assignment, and, if you have never used D2L before, that you are figuring out how to navigate it. Today's mini lecture will push the limits of the name that I have assigned it. Indeed, there are going to be 3 parts to today's lecture, adding up to a grand total of almost a half hour. Not so mini by most standards. However, in this half hour I hope to accomplish a number of things, all of which I feel are essential if you are to understand what this class is all about. First then, I hope to give you a general idea of what philosophy is. You can't succeed at baseball if you don't know what a run is, just as you cannot succeed at philosophy if you have no idea what the philosophical playing field looks like. In the second part of the lecture, I will give you an introduction to the subfield of philosophy called ethics, the field with which this course is concerned. In this section we will look at the introduction to the anthology, and I will offer some of my own ideas about what ethics is. Lastly, we will go over Crito, the reading by Plato assigned for today. For the latter 2 parts of the mini-lecture, you will be able to find a complementary PowerPoint on D2L. For this first part, however, there is no PowerPoint, just my droning voice. So then, down to business. What is philosophy? I realize that for many of you, this is your first and potentially last philosophy class. This is probably all for the best, as a society composed of philosophy nerds sitting in circles, sipping espresso, scratching chins, and contemplating the nature of truth would no doubt be a failed society. Still, I am glad that all of you are getting at least a little exposure to the field, and hope that I can do the discipline justice. Western philosophy began in Greece around 600 BC. Eastern philosophy may be even older. This noted, I should warn you that in this class we will not be covering much, and perhaps not any Eastern thought. This does not mean it is unimportant. Indeed, the little Eastern philosophy I have read has struck me as very profound. If you find yourself loving ethics and wanting more, I would heartily suggest diving into the Eastern variety. I am simply not teaching it in this course because, to put it bluntly, I know nothing about it. I thus feel it would be unfair both to you and to Eastern philosophy if I were to pretend I did. It would be sort of like when Shaq tried his hand at acting. Not pretty. The East thus commended and passed over, back to the West. As I was saying, most historians trace philosophy to 600 BC, and the mildly mythic figure known as Thales. Why does Thales merit the title of first philosopher, you may ask? I answer, because he was the first person in recorded history to look at the world around him and, using a combination of what he saw and his faculty of reason, attempt to explain it. This, at its heart, is what philosophers do. We look at the world, a world that includes poverty, poetry, northern pike Platonism, and people. We then run these observations through a filter of what we hope is clear thinking, in an attempt to make sense of this world, or at least a part of it. So what sense did Thales end up making of the world in which he found himself? The answer may be, to say the least, a bit disappointing. What Thales came up with was that everything is water. Sound like crazy talk to you? Maybe. But I'd like to suggest that there are at least 3 ways of interpreting this inaugural philosophical utterance. The first is that what Thales meant when he said, everything is made from water, is something similar to what modern physicists and scientists claim when they say that everything is made from atoms. His claim, in other words, may be that the complexity of the world is ultimately reducible to one simple building block. Another interpretation of Thales is similar. Namely, perhaps Thales meant that everything springs from a single source. This is sort of like science's hypothesis of the Big Bang, or the notion that everything ultimately is God. The third interpretation I'd like to offer is that, well, Thales really was just talking crazy talk. Whichever of these interpretations is correct is actually not all that important, because no matter what Thales was trying to say, he got it wrong. If you haven't noticed, everything is not water. What is important is that Thales succeeded in offering an explanation of the world around him, using his observation and reason, and thus succeeded in beginning philosophy. Jump forward now 200 years to Athens. Here's where we meet probably the most famous philosopher of all history, Socrates. If Thales was the first philosopher, then Socrates is the father of philosophy. If Thales was the first philosopher, then Socrates is the father of philosophy. He's the one that really matters. But while Socrates is what we may call the man, we don't actually know that much about him. Basically, we know that he never wrote anything, that he never wore shoes, that he was rather ugly, that he urinated as much as possible for health reasons, and that his own hometown killed him for being annoying. Quite the guy to have for your hero, I know. I suppose it says a lot about philosophers that we respect and try and emulate a dude who was unattractive, eccentric, disliked, and dead. More seriously, though, the reason philosophers love Socrates is that he demonstrated a philosophical life. Socrates was genuinely desperate to learn. He questioned everything, and every one he saw. He would only allow the world around him and his powers of reason to persuade him. He confronted the world head on, and would not accept cliches or easy explanations. These are all characteristics philosophers aspire to. But even more importantly, philosophers love Socrates because once he made a breakthrough, once he actually learned something about his world, he would allow that knowledge to influence the way he dwelled in that world. Once he determined that injustice is never defensible, he attempted to rid all areas of his life of it. After he determined that a good life is more important than a long one, he lived and eventually died accordingly. After Socrates, of course, philosophy has changed and matured. For one thing, while philosophers are still undeniably annoying, most of us have taken to wearing shoes and have avoided cultivating eccentric obsessions with frequent urination. And philosophy itself has changed. Indeed, in ancient times, philosophers were concerned with anything that involved observation and reason. Philosophy, after all, simply means the love of wisdom. Thus, Thales originally made his name not by his seemingly Costner-inspired Waterworld hypothesis, but rather by predicting an eclipse. He was what we would call today an astronomer. Aristotle, on the other hand, would likely be considered a biologist today. Another ancient philosopher, Pythagoras, was first and foremost a mathematician. You might recognize his name from the Pythagorean theorem. For those trivia buffs out there, it might further interest you to know that Pythagoras was also rabidly against the eating of beans and obsessed with triangles. You learn something new every day, right? As history moved on, the different areas of study as we know them today eventually branched out of philosophy. Biologists began to want a field of their own. Mathematicians stopped worrying so much about truth, beauty, and beans. Astronomers started devoting their life solely to the stars. Philosophy, in turn, like the host of a family potluck, was stuck with the leftovers. Philosophers thus stopped worrying about categorizing animals, as Aristotle and modern biologists do, and started devoting their time to more fruitful pursuits, asking wildly important questions such as, am I merely a brain in a vat? Today, philosophy is thus no longer all-encompassing. It is, in fact, left with merely 4 major areas of study: logic, epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. In order to find out exactly what these are, however, you will have to listen to part 2 of today's lecture.